Welcome, everyone. We're just going to give a few minutes to make sure that everyone's able to join. The people who RSVP'd are entering the Zoom meeting, and people who might be stuck in traffic or might be running a few minutes late, giving them a few minutes to get settled. So we'll begin in a few minutes. Thank you so much for your patience. Okay, so we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jordana Gessler, Vice President of Education and Exhibits at Holocaust Museum LA. For those of you who aren't familiar with the museum, it is the first and oldest survivor-founded Holocaust museum in the United States. We were actually founded in 1961 by a group of Holocaust survivors who wanted to create a safe place to display their precious artifacts, to commemorate their family members and loved ones who had perished, and to educate future generations on the important lessons of the Holocaust. Today, the museum continues to provide free Holocaust education to students from Los Angeles, the United States, and the world, fulfilling the mission of our founders to commemorate, educate, and inspire. Thank you so much for joining us for today's program, Photography and Social Change. Inspired by our recent special exhibition, Ruth Gruber, Photojournalist, today's program will feature curator Maya Benton and art historian and curator Alissa Schapiro in conversation about the relationship between photography and social change. For many of us on this call today, I'm sure that we're familiar with the idea of being a photojournalist, and it'll be interesting, I think, for all of us to learn about the history of photojournalism and how it's transformed through technology and media and important players like Ruth Gruber. Maya Benton is a curator, art historian, and art critic. She's organized numerous international traveling exhibitions, lectures widely, and is a frequent contributor to magazines and museum catalogs where she writes about photography, museums, and material culture. From 2008 to 2019, she was a curator at the International Center of Photography, also known as ICP, where she established a major archive and organized traveling exhibitions, including the one we are hosting, Ruth Gruber, Photojournalist. Maya has worked in museum exhibition and education departments for 25 years, including but not limited to the Getty Museum, Harvard University Art Museum, the Jewish Museum of Florence, Italy. She's a graduate of Brown University, Harvard University, and the Court Lawed Institute of Art in London. Alissa Schapiro is a curator and doctoral candidate in art history at Northwestern University, specializing in 20th century American art and the history of photography. Her scholarship assesses how the American creative field responded to news of Nazi terror in order to better understand the relationship between American wartime cultural production and the Holocaust. Her work has been supported by institutions including the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the Holocaust Educational Foundation at Northwestern University. She holds a BA in the History of Art and Architecture from Harvard University and an MA in Curatorial Studies from Cortland Institute of Art in London. She currently serves as one of the 3 co-curators for the exhibition and publication Life Magazine and the Power of Photography. The exhibition opened at Princeton University's Art Museum in February 2020 and will travel to the MFA Boston in October. Before we get started, please note that you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. You can ask a question by typing it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. It is now my pleasure to welcome Maya and Alissa. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
We're very excited. Thank you for having us, and thank you for hosting the Gruber Show.
Yes, definitely. So I guess, a little conversation about some of the works that you guys have done. Clearly, the two of you, I believe, have overlapped in your careers and your education. Maya, can you tell us a little bit about how you were drawn to photojournalism and sort of how you've curated photography and photojournalism throughout your career?
Well, I think I'll start with Ruth because she's the queen of the day. Ruth Gruber, around her 99th birthday, we started at ICP to talk about her contribution as a photojournalist. And I think, like many photojournalists, she wore many hats. And so she was a renowned journalist. She'd written over 20 books. She was the world's youngest PhD. She'd been the first foreign correspondent in the Soviet Arctic and Siberian Gulag. But she also was a woman working at a time when it was really hard for women to get these jobs. And so I think early on, she realized if I could take photographs of what I was reporting on, and I had the photographs that no one had, and I told the story, they would have to hire me and give me a job, even though I'm a woman. And I think particularly for women working in photojournalism, the bar was higher. You had to get a story someone else wasn't getting, especially in those early years, or you had to innovate. And one of the things that I love about Ruth is often with early pioneers who are women in photography, they learned photography from their spouses or from male mentors. And Ruth not only taught herself photography, but then taught her husband later in life how to be a photographer, and he incorporated that into his work. So it's a kind of wonderful inversion of the typical story. We decided that we were going to give her the Cornell Kappa Lifetime Achievement Award in photojournalism, and it coincided with her 100th birthday. And so she had never been honored as a photojournalist, which is kind of amazing because her photograph that documented survivors on the ship Exodus was published to wide acclaim and became the photo of the week in Life magazine. And I think Alissa will contextualize the publication in 1947 and what that did. But that became an iconic image of the struggle. And people have argued that it did more to change attitudes towards the British blockade against Palestine than any reporting had, or any image had for that matter. And so it really talked about the power of photography to affect real political and social change. And I think that's what has drawn me to photojournalism from the beginning. Is it's not just about documenting the world, but it's trying to document it in service of affecting change, changing hearts and minds. I think so often writers can, put down a 2,000 word story, but it's the one image that pulls at the heartstrings. And we think about that now with the refugee crisis, and a picture of one boy on a sea, one dead child on the seashore did more to affect people's attitudes and I think increase empathy than so many words were powerless to do. And even now, as we're bombarded with images and there's a saturation that I think limits the way that those things can affect empathy, still photography affects social change in a different way. My friend Lindsay Addario, who's a photographer for the New York Times, she took a photo last week, 2 weeks ago in Ukraine, of the family that had died on the bridge as they were trying to escape Ukraine. And as soon as she filed that photograph, donations increased radically to all three services in the hours after she filed that photograph, in a way that I think words alone often don't accomplish. So that's one of the things that draws me to photojournalism. That it's also, I think, a more democratized approach to photography, because it's not necessarily who you know or what studio you're in, but who can really get the story and file it. And in a world where we're so oversaturated with bad news and trauma and images, it still holds the power to affect our capacity to feel empathy and then want to do something.
Thank you so much. I mean, what you're saying is so true, especially when we're talking about the social relevance of the Holocaust or of history in general. Having photographs and making these connections with individuals, human beings who look just like us, I think really does allow people to connect with history and create that empathetic connection with one another. So I think that's just such an incredible way to sort of start off this conversation. And I know that you mentioned a little bit or touched upon Ruth Gruber's photograph that brought so much attention when it was featured in Life magazine. So I'm going to ask Alissa, can you please tell us about the influence Life magazine had here in the United States? What is its history? What was its impact? How did it influence American society and culture in the 20th century?
Sure. I love that question. I spend a lot of my time thinking and writing about Life magazine and being able to share it with new audiences is always really rewarding for me. If you don't mind, I'm sort of going to dovetail off of what Maya just said about what draws us to photojournalism. And for me, in so much of my academic and scholarly practice, I've always thought about the space in between high art and low art, which are these categories that are really problematic to begin with. And I've always felt like photojournalism comes right at the heart between high and low. You have photography, fine art photography that was in museums, the Museum of Modern Art being one of the great repositories for fine art photography, sort of in its early years. But photojournalism really is able to speak to people who care about images and fine art, but also people who want to know about the world around them, who are interested in the news, who are interested in the affairs of the day. And so the between area is really occupied in, for me, a productive way when it comes to photojournalism. And is one of the reasons why I've always loved working on Life magazine. And as you said, I'm a co-curator on this new exhibition alongside Keith Broussard at the Princeton University Art Museum and Kristen Gresh, who's also a friend of Maya's, at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston. And what we tried to do with our exhibition and our book was really contextualize the way that Life magazine pioneered its specific use of photography, of photojournalism on the pages of its magazine. Not to claim that it was the first to do it, but it found a way to be the most impactful. So you asked for some statistics. And so these are some of my favorites. So at its height, Life magazine was a weekly picture magazine. It started in November 1936 and it ended in December of 1972. So it's only a run of 36 years, but it was so important in American life and culture that at its height, it was read by about 25% of the US population. That is extraordinary. How many people read Life magazine? I should say that its demographics were really specific. It tailored itself and it was mostly consumed by white, middle-class, high school and college educated people living in the Northeast and on the West Coast, more so than in the South because of population distribution. So I always hesitate when I talk about the reach of Life magazine to say that it didn't reach everyone, it didn't speak to everyone. And then there were other magazines that came about in the wake of Life, which immediately, its first issue sold out almost immediately. Then they had to start making more, and they actually had a budget crisis in the first year of the publication in 1936 because they couldn't produce fast enough and the money that they needed to produce. And so you could get it by subscription, you can get it on newsstands on the corner of your street or in a drugstore. And you had almost immediately after the first issue in November 1936, these copycat publications coming out. And I don't mean copycat sort of in a derogatory way at all. I mean ones that said, okay, what Life magazine is doing here, which is having photographs front and center, is something that seems to really be speaking to the American public. And for that reason, you have Look magazine, which is one of Life's great competitors, coming out. You have copycats that created covers to kind of trade on the iconic block letters of Life with the red square or rectangle behind it. And so ways of drawing attention to people if they're just walking by newsstands to say, oh, is this Life? No, it's something else. And we see that all through Europe. We see it through the US. My favorite example is Ebony magazine, which starts right after at the end of World War II and has this cover that's very similar to the style of Life magazine. But Ebony, which was a monthly publication intended to speak to Black Americans about their histories, their stories that were not reflected in Life magazine, which not only was its readership predominantly white, but its staff, its editors, everyone was predominantly white. And so Ebony magazine said, okay, we're going to do sort of what Life magazine's doing, but we're really going to speak to the lived experiences of Black Americans. And they actually kind of turned the magazine on its head, and Life magazine was hesitant in the way that it used color photographs. It wasn't until the mid-50s that color photographs started being regularly on the cover of Life magazine. Whereas within the first year of Ebony magazine, they had color photographs on the cover, which really made it stand out. And we're showing this technological innovation that Life was even a little slow to get to. So Life was extraordinarily popular. We have records of how many people bought each issue, but we also know that Life created this own category called the pass along rate. And that was how many people read each issue of Life. So it might be that one family member subscribes to get Life, but there are 6 people in the household who reads it, or a doctor's office gets it, or a hair salon gets it. How many people are reading those at one time? So again, it's in the years that I work on, which is mainly World War II, the readership was about 15% of Americans, but it was so popular that even during World War II, Life magazine made a special lightweight advertisement-free issue to send to troops overseas because they were missing Life magazine and they wanted to know what was going on at home, but also what was happening in the war effort. So in summary, incredibly popular, even though it ends in 1972 as a weekly. It comes up again later, it recreates itself, refashions itself as a monthly. And then even today, it has these special issues. So whenever there's a big anniversary that happens, like the anniversary of the moon landing, they'll put out a special issue, or a royal wedding, they'll put out a special issue. And it still remains kind of in our cultural consciousness about this moment when photography was a way to really communicate and to see the world around you in new ways. And that being, as Maya said, more impactful than text. And Life's sort of innovation, what they claim to be their innovation, it was drawn on a bunch of different sources, was the creation of the photo essay, where you have, they're often between 8 and 12 pages. You have multiple photographs, sometimes between 25 and 30 photographs, telling a story with only minimal text. So there's the introductory text and then these short captions under photographs. It was really allowing the photographs to speak for themselves. And in the instance of Ruth Gruber's incredible, iconic photograph of the ship Exodus 1947, which is showing these Jewish Holocaust refugees being sent back to Germany because they weren't allowed into Palestine, British Mandate Palestine, because of the blockade. It's a photograph where these Jewish prisoners, they really were in prison again on these prison ships, took a flag, the British flag, the Union Jack, and they painted a swastika on it and hung it from the mast of the ship. And because she was there doing her humanitarian work, and as a photographer, she took this photograph, and I looked up the way she's credited in Life magazine, and it says Ruth Gruber for the New York Herald Tribune of the AP, the Associated Press, which I just found really interesting, the sort of levels of how do you credit someone who's worked in these different ways. Oh, amazing. Thank you. There is the photograph. And this was not part of a story. And Life magazine had staff photographers. They also had freelance photographers. And then they drew from these other sources like the Associated Press, as they did for the image on the right. I don't think we have how it appeared in Life magazine, but it was next to the editorial, and it was called Picture of the Week. And so it was this one photograph to say, look, there's all this stuff happening right now in the post-war moment. You have Holocaust survivors, you have Jews desperately trying to get into British Mandate Palestine when there were still these immigration quotas there and all across the world, including in the US. And here you have this instance where these Jews are equating what the Brits are doing to them to what the Nazis had just done to them. And so it being the Picture of a Week, was not part of a larger story. It was one photograph necessary to tell this entire tale. And you see, even compositionally, you have the fence, you see them kind of enclosed in en masse, really crammed together and compressed, similar to some of the photographs that you saw of the ghettos, the Nazi ghettos during World War II or in the concentration camps. And so, as Maya said, and Maya, you know way more about this than I do, the impact of this photograph and how it changed legislation, one, because it's iconic in the way that it's framed. It tells us so much in one image, and because it was printed in Life magazine and elsewhere. And so you have at that point almost a quarter of the US public seeing this image.
Wow, thank you so much, Alissa. And I think, it's so fascinating to hear a little bit more about the role that Life magazine played in American society, but also thinking about it historically at this really pivotal turning point, like coming out of the Great Depression in the US and the beginnings of the Holocaust in Europe, and the role that then photography and the ability for stories to be shared, and that the empathetic response that we were talking about earlier. I think it's such a critical turning point and transitional moment in history, in society. So a little bit more about the impact of Ruth Gruber's Exodus photograph. And Maya, if you could tell us a little bit about the way in which Ruth was able to finagle her way to get a camera onto the ship.
Yeah, it's such an interesting story. There were a bunch of photographers. So Ruth was one of many photographers who was sitting on the Haifa port as the ship Exodus was kind of battered by these much larger British ships. And she had famously said, it looked like a matchbox squashed by a nutcracker, the ship. And I think to show the kind of British nautical might and this small ship that was overstuffed with humans. And when they were forcibly taken off the ship, and then she documented everyone being forcibly removed from the ship, the 4,500 passengers, the wounded, the dead, their belongings, in an incredible photo series. But then they were sent back and no one knew where they were going. So now in hindsight, we know that they were sent back to Germany. But the British didn't want they didn't want any of the reporters to follow the ship, because obviously it didn't look great for them to be sending survivors back to Germany. So all of the photographers and journalists were told they're going to Cyprus, which makes sense because Cyprus is where so many of the survivors who were trying to get into Palestine were sent. And so Ruth went and documented Cyprus. And as you had mentioned about the iconography of the people behind the fence on the ship, I think there was a conscious portrayal that referenced the Holocaust images that were starting to kind of come out in the picture press and in other contexts. And so, because now we're so familiar with the images of the liberation of the camps and the ghettos, but in 47 they were just starting to see the light of day. I mean, that's the thing that the evolving kind of reception and publication of those images and the way that they were starting to seep into national visual consciousness was just really starting. And so from 45 to 47. So she goes and she takes pictures of Cyprus internment camp, and she takes a picture of the tower and she says it's architecture straight out of Auschwitz. And she found the tower that looked like Auschwitz, and she found other structures that looked like the Warsaw Ghetto. And so this is a time when the American public and the European public is starting to kind of become familiar with and gain an understanding of kind of Nazi vernacular prison architecture. And she's framing her shots and text to go with it that's referencing that, and saying that this, it was 110 degrees, showing a baby in a hot metal bucket. And in these kind of boiling hot, and she describes the smells and the piercing heat in a way that it transports people to these places. She shows the orphans kind of sitting in these outdoor prisons, but they're waiting and waiting, and there's no ship. And so a few of the journalists find out that they're being sent to Port de Bout, and they're prisoners in France. And the prisoners are like, we are not getting off the ship. We are not getting off the ship in Europe. You can kill us. We'll die here on the ship. But they let some of the children, a few people who were sick, and a few of the older people, anyone who wanted to get off could. And then the rest of the prisoners, the more than 90%, decided that they were staying on the ship, and that if they die on the ship, they would. And so there were 3 ships, and one was Runnymede Park. And the 4,500 prisoners from Exodus were divided onto these 3 ships when they were sent back to Europe. So all the journalists go to Cyprus, no ship comes. Ruth and a few others were like, wait, they're going to Europe. They get there, and the prisoners are like, we're not getting off. So the French were like, we're going to bring them food. So the French start bringing them bread and food onto these ships that are docked there. And there were, I think, 6 latrines for, 1,700 people. And she goes down into the hull of the ship, which became I have the cover of the little booklet that we produced, but you can see it's kind of like the hull of the ship. and the only light was coming in from one of the portholes under the ship. And she starts to describe kind of, what she's seeing. She had brought the camera on and she hadn't hidden it. It was like around her side, but she was a 5 foot tall little woman. And the two other reporters, each on the other two ships, were kind of big hulking men. And they were told no cameras. Ruth just kind of took hers and no one paid attention to her. She was like this woman going on a ship. And she spoke fluent, Yiddish and German and Russian. And she got on this ship and everyone was like, this woman is here to save us. And they said, tell the world what they're doing to us. Tell them our story. And the prisoners absolutely understood the power of images to highlight their situation. They were co-authors of this image. So the defacing of the flag that Alissa talked about was done for the camera. I mean, they were doing this to say, show the world what they're doing to us. And they implored Ruth, tell the world what's happening to us. So she gets off the ship with her camera. And then one of the generals, the British generals, notices her camera. And he says, give me your camera. He wants to have that. And she's like, I'm not giving you my camera. She was 5 feet tall, but she was very tough. And she rushes and files the photographs with her editor at the New York Herald Tribune. And this is, I think, so connected to what Alissa was laying out in terms of 25% of America was Life, were reading Life magazine, because New York Herald Tribune had a large readership in New York, but it was regional. And she sent the photos on the wire, and bless her editor, he wrote back to her immediately with a telegram saying, these photographs don't belong to us. They belong to the world.
Wow.
And he put the photo on the wire. And that's why what Alissa was charting with the AP, and if you can go back to the verso of the photograph in the exhibition, we have the original photograph, but we also have the stamps that show how it circulated. And I think he understood that if it went to the New York Herald Tribune, it wouldn't be showing the world, it would be showing the New York Herald Tribune readership. And so by putting it on the wire and giving it to the AP and offering it for free, it was able to circulate, and that's how it became the picture of the week, and that's how it drew attention to the plight of people on the ship. So I will say that it did a tremendous amount, but I had an interesting conversation with a friend of mine who's British a couple of days ago, and Alissa and I both spent some of our education in the UK, and this show is going to be going to London. And he's very educated Brit. He went to Eton and he went to Oxford and he studied history. He did not know about the Cyprus internment camps.
Wow.
And he is like as educated as you could get in the British system, and studied history at Oxford. He had never heard of the British internment camps. And even the book Haven was not published in the UK until the 90s. And so what's interesting is, on the one hand, this New York Herald Tribune picture editor who knew that this image belonged to the world and could change hearts and minds, and understood the power of photography to affect social change, and the power of like the picture of the week in Life magazine, and the people on the ship who were like, show the world what's happening. That was actually it was transmitted in Europe and in New York and in America, but not in England. These images were totally suppressed in the UK. And that's something I understood at the time, but now the legacy of that has really continued. Even incredibly educated Brits who studied history are not learning about the British blockade, that they were sending survivors and interning them in Cyprus and sending them back to Germany. So I'm very excited that this will be going to London, because I was really surprised that this wide circulation, the importance of this photograph, and it shows that even when a photo becomes kind of like national news, I mean, if you think about what's happening in Ukraine now, those images, we're all seeing them, but people in Russia aren't. And for a host of different reasons, was a real filtering of images. And so I think that's also something that we have to keep in mind. There were these huge readerships, but there were also a lot of powers at play to suppress those images, because they too knew how powerful they were in calling out injustice and bad behavior, to understate it.
Yeah, wow. I mean, it's such an incredible story. And I think to really underscore, Maya, the fact that we are very sometimes thinking here in the US today in 2022, how easy it is to access information. So of course, like everyone here is probably like, well, how did the British citizens not know, or the citizens in the United Kingdom not know that their own government was interning Holocaust survivors in camps? And so, it must have been technology. Like they didn't have technology back then. But I think what we're really missing is the ways in which governments and people control access to images and control access to information. And it's not necessarily something that has to do with technology, but very much something that has to do with human nature. So I'm absolutely thrilled to hear that the Ruth Gruber exhibit is going to the UK, because I think having not just this photograph, but I know in the collection, there are unbelievable photographs, both of survivors right after the Holocaust, really protesting, asking, begging, pleading that they want to return to their Jewish homeland. And then, of course, the photographs in the displaced persons, or in the internment camps in Cyprus, where once again, they're living behind barbed wire. So I guess, shifting back a little bit to the US, are there other standout moments in history of photography where particular photographs have really changed the meaning or participated or inspired action? Alissa, is there a photograph that you've seen either in Life magazine or elsewhere where it really does call upon the people in this way that Maya talked about at the beginning of the program to have this empathetic, strong response?
It's a great question. I have a few that come to mind. If we're thinking photo history, I go back to Jacob Riis and the progressive era photographs that he took, How the Other Half Lives, where he went into tenement buildings in New York and photographed in a way that we would think is kind of violent now. He had his flash and would just have the flash go off and take a photo of people living in squalor in tenement buildings on the Lower East Side of New York. And that was used. He then used those images to give talks about progressive era reforms that needed to happen. And that really inspired change. It inspired city governments to figure out ways to construct tenement housing and housing projects to have air come in and have these sort of hygienic protocols that were really lacking in tenement buildings in the late 19th and early 20th century. So that's one example. I also, if we go a little bit later in history, I think of President Roosevelt's The New Deal and the Farm Security Administration and the photographers who were tapped by the government to take photographs of the people and the places who were hurting the most from the Great Depression. And so one of the most famous photographs is Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother, showing that this woman in this migrant camp with her children who's starving, really, and the photographs of the Dust Bowl. And then one photographer who I work on a lot, and I'm like dying to collaborate with Maya on something. I know that you love Margaret Burke-White as well, but Margaret Burke-White, who was one of the first photographers who worked for Fortune magazine, which was a sister publication of Life. They're both founded by Henry Luce. She was one of the first 4 photographers hired to work on Life magazine. She was this extraordinary woman, a real pioneer, and would be a pioneer no matter her gender, but additionally, the fact that she was a woman made her sort of pioneering efforts all the more sensational at the time. And in 1937, she and her then husband, Erskine Caldwell, who was a writer, they photographed Tobacco Row. They went through the South and produced a book called You Have Seen Their Faces, which was, really this incredible document of social documentary images and text. And you have Dorothea Lange collaborating on books. You have, Walker Evans. You have all of these photographers who are working with the government during the Great Depression through the New Deal, right? So government supported to get people to care about what's happening to people in the South and in the West who are struggling the most because of the Depression. And in order to inspire everyday Americans to come on board with the necessity of these social programs through the New Deal to sort of pull the US out of the Great Depression. So you have that sort of leading up to the moment of World War II. I can talk forever about sort of advocacy, photographic advocacy during World War II. Obviously, we talked a little bit with Ruth Gruber, but I think it might be interesting to think about how it still functions today. And one photographer whose work I'm really fascinated by is a young man named Julio Cortez, who works for the Associated Press, who took what have become iconic images in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis. And they're a few weeks after his murder, with all of the different activities happening in Minneapolis and throughout the world, these different protests, he photographed this young man wearing a face mask, you can sort of see, and he's shadowed behind this upside down American flag as he's holding it, and he holds it as he walks, sort of you see him in profile, he walks in front of a building that's on fire. And it says, it has the name of a town in Minnesota, and you have even the telegraph wires, the telephone wires on fire behind it. And it's this moment beautifully captured of extreme anxiety, violence, pain, everything that was being felt at that moment. And something that I traced for myself was all the different news outlets that used this photograph. So it was used by the New York Times on the cover of the Times for a news article about what was happening in Minnesota. It was used in the New York Times as part of an editorial about looting and rioting. It was used by literally like the same day, Fox News for another editorial. It was also on Newsweek. It was everywhere and used in these different ways. And so I think because we have this proliferation of media and access to media, yes, you can be kind of overwhelmed by how many images exist of these moments in history, but there are some that still are able to cut through and then are used probably against the wishes of the photographer, I would assume, in different ways. And so, yes, they can be manipulated to different ends, but we still see the power of photojournalism to help us understand, come to terms with, mourn, for instance. And I think this really is an image of mourning, Julio Cortez's photograph, but it's one that really sticks out in my mind of being so potent that people on opposite sides of the ideological spectrum still really get something out of it and want to use it to help tell these different stories.
Thank you, Alissa. So I guess my next question is sort of in the vein of us talking about, Ruth speaking these languages, having a relationship or an identity with Jewish people. I'm kind of curious what both of your opinions or takes are on how does the identity of the photographer shape the photograph, or even does it? How important is it for the intention of the photographer when the photographer takes the photo? Is there a different intention whether somebody is truly like working as a photojournalist in the moment, or potentially somebody who happens to be in the right place and happens to have a camera? And is there a distinction between either of those things?
You were asking about photography that is an example of kind of affecting social change. And I think that there's a bridge between your question and the last question, which is the predominance of Jewish photographers documenting the civil rights movement in the American South. And I see that as a question that someone had posed about the Emmett Till photograph. And I think, when you had asked about photography and examples, I was thinking, of course, of Reese, as Alissa mentioned, and Migrant Mother. But Robert Frank's Cover of the Americans, was like one of the iconic images that comes to mind. And it's the picture of the segregated bus. So you see the white people in the front of the bus and then the black people at the back of the bus. And that's the cover of his book. There was a Swiss Jewish immigrants' depiction of what American life was. And this was this moment of kind of post-war boom and utopia and a fantasy of this American life that could be had, the promise of the American dream. And here is someone coming in and capturing the scars, the racial scars in many ways that define so much of kind of post-war American existence, including Jim Crow. And he wasn't alone in that. I mean, if you think of Danny Lyon or Bruce Davidson or Leonard Freed or Jill Friedman, Steve Shapiro, Bob Edelman. I mean, most of the iconic photographs documenting the civil rights movement in the American South and even documenting the Black Panther movement and the iconic images of the Black Panthers were taken by Jewish photographers. And I think there are so many interesting questions about the identity of the photographer and the Jewish biography of the photographer, and how much that you should and can read into the photograph based on biography. And Alissa and I had a conversation earlier about the liberation of the camps and who took those photographs. And, you know, it also plays into like the photographs of the Warsaw ghettos. And we understand if it's a Nazi taking the photo or Judenrat taking the photo, or a victim, like the victim perpetrator as author, and how much we understand and read the photo based on the authorship. The civil rights movement in the American South is a really interesting question. Why is it that so many of the iconic photos documenting the civil rights struggle were taken by Jews? And I think the answer to that, and I think their Jewish identity is really central to understanding it, is that they were white presenting and white passing. And so they had access to white racist spaces. And at the same time, they were other. And in fact, at some point, Robert Frank is taken to jail in the South, and he's described by the cop as a foreigner. And that someone had called him the K word. So this kind of foreigner / Jew as other was certainly felt by the photographers, but yet, like Danny Lyon writes about how people would talk to him about Black people as if he was in on this racist kind of conspiracy with them. And so he had access to the quotes and the text and the feelings. And yet once they found out he was a Jew, he was also otherized, of course. And so I think there's this kind of white passing ability to participate in the white racist spaces that allow you to document them, and at the same time being very much an other. And I also think appropriately for Passover, most of these Jewish photographers were largely assimilated and secular. And like Avedon, who took the famous portraits of Baldwin, many of these photographers, Robert Frank among them, Avedon, Bruce Davidson, Danny Lyon, the only Jewish thing they do every year is Passover Seder. Don't go to the synagogue for the high holidays. They, don't keep any kind of kashrut. They don't do Shabbat.
The best holiday, I get it.
Seder, and this is appropriate for what's happening tomorrow night, that Avedon every year had a huge Seder. And it was like the supermodels and the editors and like Avedon presiding over the Seder, because when his father, Israel Avedon, had died, he said, have a Seder every year. But what is that? Like, it's Jewish photographers who are largely assimilated and secular, who are once a year connecting to their Jewish identity by talking about freedom and slavery and liberation. And then they're going and documenting the civil rights movement in the American South. I think that identity and context, and also the notion of kind of Jews as white passing, is crucial to understanding the work and why it is that so many of those iconic images were taken by Jews. So that's the beginning of what could be, a 10-hour long conversation.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a fascinating piece of it as well, and really does actually connect also with the Holocaust, because the civil rights movement is not it's only a few decades, not even, away from the Holocaust itself. And even when you hear, and this is in photography, it's words, but like Rabbi Joachim Prince, who spoke right before Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, speaking specifically about how he experienced his childhood as a German Jew in Nazi Germany. He's speaking of and understanding his position in being somebody who's white passing and being somebody with a voice to speak out that nobody should be discriminated against. So it is a really interesting tie-in, especially as we're moving away from the 1930s, 40s and 50s, and cameras do become more accessible to people. In fact, I was just at an exhibition last night, and there was a print of the Gordon Parks photograph of the little Black boy who's pointing at a white doll. And I believe, Alissa, he was the first Black photographer who worked at Life magazine. And really, I mean, speaking to the aspects of what we started off the conversation with, that photographs have a power that words do not. And that photograph really speaks to how the American education system at that time was telling children that white skin was better. So I guess, Alissa, if you could speak a little bit maybe about how that photograph was received, how it was printed in Life, and how that photographer sort of began at the magazine.
Yeah, so Gordon Parks is an extraordinary example of how an outsider served a predominantly white publication. He was the only Black staff photographer ever at the magazine during its 36-year run as a weekly. He was tokenized in that way. And his first photo essay that brought him to the magazine, he actually went to Life magazine and said, I have a story to pitch. I want to pitch a story about the Harlem gang wars. And as a Black man, I am uniquely able to gain the trust of some of these young gang leaders. The one he became close to was named Red Jackson in Harlem. And, I can get them to they'll allow me to tell their story, and to tell their story in a way that's not judgmental, that's not prejudiced, that's not anything other than trying to show the humanity of these people who are struggling in New York City during this time. And so Life says, okay, you can do this story. He does Harlem Gang Leader. It becomes a massive success, and he gets hired by the magazine. When Maya was talking about Jews as being white passing and able to infiltrate these spaces in the South during the civil rights movement, on the other sort of end of it is a Life photographer who was not a staff photographer named Frank Dandridge, who lives in Los Angeles, who was one of the most important freelance photographers of the 1960s, who photographed racial violence all throughout the country. And he and I have become very close through my work on the Life magazine exhibition and book. He famously photographed Sarah Jean Collins, the little girl who survived the 16th Street Baptist church bombing that killed 4 little girls, including her sister. And Frank told me the story about how he was able to take this photograph of Sarah Jean Collins, which was printed in Life magazine, alongside an editorial an excerpt from a speech by a white Birmingham lawyer who says, every racist person, you are to blame for this little girl being blinded right now. And it's this photograph of her with singed hair and white patches over her eyes in the hospital. And Frank told me that it was actually the reporter he worked with, was another Black man named Mark Crawford. Frank told me that he, Mark Crawford, and Gordon Parks would have lunch together at Life because they felt like such outsiders. There weren't really Black individuals in their positions, let alone there were like no Black women, but especially Black men in their positions at Life. And so they would have lunch together. And Mark Crawford, who was also Black, was really sort of integrated within these civil rights communities, and including in Birmingham. And through his contacts, he was able to get in touch with Sarah Jean and Addie Mae, who was killed, their mother. And she said, I have this photographer. He's a freelance photographer. He's doing something for Life magazine. Can you take him to see your daughter? And he convinced her. And so she took Frank Dandridge to the hospital, the University of Alabama Birmingham Hospital, to see her daughter. It's a longer story. He was rushed out of the hospital. It was a segregated hospital. And the fact that he was there with a camera, everyone sort of went crazy on him. And so he took some really quick photographs of Sarah Jean Collins and then ran out. And it ended up becoming one of the most iconic photographs of the civil rights movement. So while he wasn't able to get into many spaces as a Black man, the kind of heart of civil rights activity, which were within the larger Black populations, he was welcomed with open arms. And similarly to what you were saying, Maya, about the Holocaust survivors saying, help us tell our story, that's sort of what Frank experienced during the 1960s. So I think that that's really an interesting thing to think about in terms of access and how it goes both ways. And going back to Maya's reference to photographs of the liberated concentration camps, a chapter in my dissertation, something I've been working on for years. And Margaret Burke-White, who I mentioned earlier, was actually half Jewish. It was something that she was afraid to acknowledge. She mentions she wrote a lot. She wrote many books and sometimes mentioned her Judaism, but very little. But one of her biographers, Vicki Goldberg, her primary biographer, had access to Margaret Burke-White's journal. And she had this moment in her journal where she admits that she told her psychiatrist that she was a Jew. And her father, who was of Polish descent, her mother was not Jewish. Her mother was really anti-Semitic. And she had this kind of push and pull between identifying with outsiders, knowing that she was a Jew, but also not wanting to admit it. And so it manifests itself in a really interesting way in the spring of 1945. So it's April 1945. She is assigned for Life magazine with credentials but from the US government and the US military to follow along General Patton's Third Army as it went through Germany. And she was there for the liberation of Buchenwald. And while she was there, unlike some other photographers, there were 5 Life photographers who photographed the liberated camps. Only 4 of them had their photographs make it into the May 7th, 1945 issue of Life, the day before VE Day. These photographs of liberation are in Life magazine. It's important to note that Life magazine never used the word Jew in their coverage, and including these photographs, the highest quality, the largest scale photographs of liberation printed anywhere in the country. And they didn't use the word Jew. But we know from Margaret Burke White's caption files, the notes, thank you, Harmony, the notes that Margaret Burke White typed up alongside the negatives that she sent back to New York while she was at Buchenwald. And so you see the bottom 2 photographs on the right are by Margaret Burke White. She actually mentions the Jews that she met in the camp dozens of times. I think it's actually 12 times that she mentions it in her 9-page caption file. Here you see the first instance of it. We printed this in our book for the first time. Probably the greatest discovery I've ever made in my life was finding this document in the Life magazine picture collection. And so you see here, she's talking about Jews in the camps. And not only that, she made sure that she went to the barracks where Jews were held at Buchenwald, which were the worst barracks, as you can imagine, in that camp in Germany. They were all the way in the back. They were the worst conditions. Harmony, if you can go back 1 slide, if you don't mind. Or forward a couple. So that here you have Margaret Burke White photographing, but here you see these 2 photographs on the bottom right, and these are from the Jewish barracks. She really made sure to go. It wasn't, she says that she used her camera as a way to keep distance from what she was seeing, but we actually know that she was so up close and personal, meeting these survivors, meeting these people on the brink of death, many of whom died while she was there and after they were too ill to be saved, that she went to make sure that she documented the Jews in the camp and wrote in her notes, which were the kind of raw materials that were then used for captions in the magazine about these Jews. And we know specifically from these notes that this is from one of the Jewish barracks. These 2 photographs are from the Jewish barracks, one of which Elie Wiesel was in during liberation. And yet Life magazine decided not to include any of that information about the survivors and the victims being Jews in their coverage, May 7th, 1945. Again, the day before Victory in Europe Day and a few months before the end of the war, with the surrender of Japan. So if we think about why she might have done this, someone who really wanted to hide her Jewish identity, why would she do something like that? What could have spurred her to do that? And I think it really was coming to terms with the fact that this could have been her. And Vicki Goldberg, her biographer, says, the reason why these photographs are never contextualized to say that they represent Jews was because Margaret Burke White had such a complicated relationship with her own Judaism. It's actually not true, obviously, because she wrote it in her notes. And then in 1946, if Harmony, you could go a few forward if you don't mind. 2 more, I think. Yeah. So in 1946, Margaret Burke White publishes a book called Dear Fatherland, Rest Quietly, one of many books she wrote, something she and Ruth Gruber had in common. They were sort of prolific writers. And she talks about her experience of driving through Germany with Hitler's Third Army. And here you have this photograph, which is a horrifying photograph. It was not one of the ones obviously selected for Life magazine, but you see here, she says it's in reference to a local civilian from outside the Buchenwald camp who came in, and General Patton and General Eisenhower forced people from around the camps, these civilians, to come in and witness what was done in their name. And here you have this one woman looking away from, this is the courtyard at Buchenwald, from this mass of corpses. And it says, Fraulein, you who cannot bear to look, did you agree about the Jews? Will you tell your children the Fuhrer was good at heart? So here, even in 1946, she's not shying away from the fact that these people were Jews, even though that's sort of been written out of her history. And then if I could say one more thing related to what Maya was talking about and the number of Jewish photographers who were photographing the civil rights movement, even before that, during the 1930s, you have all of these Jewish artists who were painters, they were printmakers, these social realist artists who were making work throughout the 30s. And a lot of them were socialist or communist leading members of the US Communist Party. And the second most popular subject in their work from the 1930s, the first most popular was anti-capitalist, so the kind of fat cat of capitalism. The second was anti-lynching. So I think there was really this affinity between the Jewish struggle and the Black American struggle that Jewish artists understood at that time and were trying to raise awareness. And I think part of that comes from Jewish teaching and tradition. The idea of tikkun olam, the idea of empathizing with others, of speaking out when you see evil being done. I think that being such a part of Jewish culture and tradition, even for Jews who have been assimilated, but many of these Jewish artists were actually born in Russia and Poland, in the Pale of Settlement, in Lithuania. And they came over, and when they were in the old country, most of them had more traditional religious identities, and over the years became more assimilated. But it always struck me how important the struggle for freedom for Black Americans, how much that impacted Jewish Americans and Jewish American artists and photographers and writers who were empathetic to their plight, because they felt it just the same way that, you know, the KKK in the 1910s and 1920s and 1930s was not just attacking Black communities, was their violence against Black communities was much sort of more intense and more violent than for Jewish communities, but the KKK also marched through Jewish communities. And so there really was this identification, which I think we forget about today, in a way that we shouldn't, because our stories, our histories are more similar than we seem to remember today.
I mean, this is just such an incredible conversation, and I feel inspired, I'm sure everyone does, to really consider the ways in which that we can use our tools, whether it be a camera or a pen and paper, to tell stories. And I guess sort of like my last question, or the last question we have for you, is how has technology changed photography and social change? Like we've been talking a lot about the Holocaust, and we've been talking a lot about the civil rights movement in America. And I know, Maya, you mentioned your friend who took that unbelievable photograph that did change Americans' understanding of what's going on in Ukraine right now. But how does like an iPhone, how has that sort of changed the way that people are using photography and understanding social change?
I think, you know, in two different ways, in terms of its ability to amplify smaller regional stories, and also in the kind of activist citizen journalism, right? So if you think about George Floyd and the young woman who, or I think she was a girl, she was 17, who took the video, you know, it used to be that it was the police's word against, you know, a victim / perpetrator's word, right? And now everyone is armed with a camera. And so that that democratization of citizen journalism is, I think, the good part, because I get so irritated in some ways by the kind of deluge of images. And on the other hand, there is this sense now that everyone is empowered to tell their own story and to document their own word. And so people who are historically less powerful or believed now are armed with the tools that help sustain their fight for their own rights and equality, right? So I think that's one piece. And then the other piece is a show that I have on the road right now. Is called Southern Rights, and it's photographer Jillian Laub, who documented racially segregated proms and homecoming rituals in the American South. And these are towns, small towns in Georgia, where they have the white prom and the black prom, the white homecoming queen and the black homecoming queen. And the year that the schools were integrated in the early 70s, many years after Brown versus Board of Ed, because they found all these loopholes to avoid integration. But as soon as they integrated, all the social stuff was separated. So the black child would crown the black queen, the white child would crown the white queen. And they were not allowed to dance together, to celebrate together. even though there were sometimes these high schools had 50 kids in a graduating class who'd been together since kindergarten, they couldn't celebrate together, they couldn't dance together. And Jillian went down there and photographed this story, and it was published in Spin magazine and didn't make a ripple. 5 years later, she'd been telling the story for many years. It was published in the New York Times, and then it became the New York Times Magazine story of the week. Mm-hmm. And then it became the most widely circulated story for 6 weeks. And this was when Obama was president. And no one could believe that this was still happening when we had a Black president. And I would tell the story and people would say, when? And I'd be like, now. But all of a sudden, because that story was circulated and forwarded to everyone from the New York Times, this town, all of these towns were basically forced and shamed and pressured into finally integrating after all of these years. And so I think there's the power of the kind of digital spread of information that is able to amplify what would otherwise be a small and regional story. And it's often the most oppressed and powerless are also the most kind of regional, not plugged into the national networks that can get the attention. And so it used to be that if it was in a small regional paper, you needed the national pressure and sense of outrage and injustice. And it was so interesting to see in Spin magazine in 2002, didn't do anything. In 2010, all of a sudden it was emailed to everyone. So I think that there's a lot of comfort that you can draw in understanding that everyone has access to not only tell their own story in their own words, but for those stories to be amplified in a way that affects social change. So it's not just the 15 staff photographers on Life magazine who were emboldened with, and then their editors assigning those stories, deciding what we should all be outraged by, but really anyone with a camera and an understanding of the power of their own story can have it amplified and can draw national attention and outrage to affecting change. And that's something that I think is very new.
Wow, I mean, it's just going into the Jewish holiday of Passover and thinking about telling stories of freedom and telling stories that will change our understanding of other human beings. I can't think of a more incredible place to sort of end in thinking about the tools that we have to make a change. And I just want to thank Maya and Alissa on behalf of the museum, on behalf of our community, for sharing your time and your expertise with us today and really giving us a lot to digest and think about when it comes to photography and the use of photography. Before we sign off, I want to invite everyone to join us virtually on Thursdays at 11 a.m. every Thursday for our weekly Holocaust Survivor Talk. Next week, we will actually be hearing from survivor Ava Perlman. I encourage you to join one, hear about survivors, take in their stories, and really consider how this can change our intentions for creating a more dignified world. You can also join us for our in-person exhibit of our new temporary exhibition, Hidden History, Recounting the Shanghai Jewish Story, opening April 24th. You can find more information about the exhibition on our website. You can find also more information about our virtual events on our website, or subscribe to our YouTube channel and watch this and other recordings of Holocaust Museum LA's public programs. Holocaust Museum LA brings you programs like today's at no charge. If you are enjoying our programs, please consider supporting our work by becoming a member. To learn more about our membership levels and benefits, visit holocaustmuseumla.org/membership. Thank you again, Maya and Alissa, and all of you for joining us today. Whether you're celebrating Easter, Passover, Ramadan, or none of the above, I'm wishing you a very lovely holiday weekend and enjoying, as we move through spring, the wonderful options and programs we have. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Harmony, for organizing.
Thank you, Harmony, for organizing it. And thank you, Jordana, for bringing Ruth Gruber to Los Angeles.
Of course, it was our pleasure. Bye, everyone.